Canada can't seem to escape his wrath. From a trade war to threats of becoming the 51st state to delaying the opening of a cross-border bridge.
A big new security doctrine. It's got consequences for Canada.
The U.S. may not be buying Canada with a check, but Washington is increasingly acting like it can shape what Canada does, who it trades with, and which strategic assets matter. The new security doctrine puts the entire hemisphere under stronger American control, and for Carney, that means Canada's sovereignty is suddenly being tested in ways Ottawa cannot ignore.
Canada to become a part of the United States as its 51st state. And reports now say that Canada is also preparing for any such eventuality. Now, Canada's military has already created a model of an American assault on the country.
For Mark Carney, this is the nightmare scenario. He spent months talking about Canadian sovereignty, independence, and the need for middle powers to stand together. Now, Washington is basically saying the opposite. The United States wants control over the strategic environment around it, and Canada sits directly inside that environment. Trade, Arctic access, energy, resources, defense, and infrastructure are all becoming part of the same argument. The new American national security strategy is where this becomes much more than political rhetoric. The doctrine reportedly revives a Monroe-style approach to the Western Hemisphere. The basic message is simple. Outside powers should not control critical assets in America's neighborhood, and Washington intends to remain the dominant force across the region. Canada is not specifically being sold at an auction, but it is clearly inside that sphere.
A more direct U.S. challenge of the Northwest Passage and Canadian sovereignty in that context.
There's a long-standing dispute between Canada and the United States over the status of the Northwest Passage. Canada says it's an internal waterway. The United States has never recognized that claim.
That matters because the language goes far beyond ordinary diplomacy. The strategy reportedly talks about preventing foreign assets from gaining control inside the hemisphere. Think about what that could mean for Canada. Chinese investment, European defense partnerships, foreign ownership of ports, mines, technology, infrastructure, or strategic resources could all become issues. Washington decides it has a direct interest in controlling.
Whether provinces start asking for the ability to join the United States, or while you see more provinces voting to get away from Canada to do business with the United States.
This is why the phrase "buy Canada" suddenly makes more sense when you look at how power actually works. You do not always need to own a country on paper. If you control its largest market, influence its infrastructure, dominate its defense environment, depend on its resources, and determine which foreign powers can operate there, legal ownership becomes almost secondary. That is the pressure Canada is now facing.
It's an internal waterway. The United States has never recognized that claim, and it said it's an international waterway, and yet when there's amicable relationships between the two countries, they just agree to differ.
And nowhere is that pressure more obvious than in the Arctic. Canada has long claimed the Northwest Passage as an internal Canadian waterway. The United States has never fully accepted that position and has historically argued that the route should be treated as an international waterway. For years, both governments managed that disagreement quietly because the overall relationship was strong enough to avoid turning it into a crisis.
That Northwest Passage is an international waterway and goes further than simply saying it, insists on access to that waterway.
The new strategy changes the tone completely. Washington is now emphasizing access, strategic transit routes, naval operations, and control of the hemisphere. That places the Northwest Passage directly in the spotlight. If the U.S. begins insisting on unrestricted access, Canada would face a direct challenge to one of its most important sovereignty claims. Carney could make all the speeches he wants, but enforcing that claim is another matter entirely.
How do you think Canada's going to look in another year? Sweeping tariffs, repercussions for helping Cuba, the continual pokes with the stick against a giant lion.
Canada's Arctic territory is enormous, sparsely populated, difficult to defend, and increasingly valuable. Melting ice is opening shipping routes. Critical minerals are becoming more important. Russia and China are expanding their Arctic interests. The US sees the region as a security issue, not just a Canadian map problem. And once Washington starts viewing Canadian territory through a national security lens, Ottawa loses room to pretend this is simply another disagreement between friends.
It is to be noted that a military model is a conceptual and a theoretical framework. It is not an actionable military plan yet.
That helps explain why Canada is reportedly modeling something almost unthinkable: how the country might respond to a US assault. The reports describe a conceptual military framework, not an actual operational war plan. But even that distinction does not make the situation normal. Canada is seriously studying what resistance could look like if its closest ally ever became the threat rather than the protector. The reported model is based on asymmetric resistance because Canada knows it could not defeat the United States in a conventional war. That could mean small units, drones, sabotage, disruption, and long-term resistance rather than tanks meeting tanks at the border. The fact military planners are even discussing those possibilities tells you how deeply the political relationship has deteriorated.
He wants our resources. He wants our oil and gas. He wants our minerals. There's no lumber in British Columbia. They've already stated they're out of lumber. They don't care about the auto sector because they have that in Detroit. They don't care about that stuff. They care about Saskatchewan. They care about Alberta.
This is not confidence. This is a country looking at the enormous imbalance between itself and the United States and asking what happens if diplomacy fails completely. Canada has spent decades relying heavily on American defense capacity. NORAD intelligence sharing, continental air defense, logistics, technology, and military cooperation are deeply integrated. Now Ottawa is discussing how to survive if the same country providing that security becomes the source of pressure.
For the first time in over a century, the Canadian Armed Forces have developed a comprehensive plan to defend against a potential U.S. invasion, and it's raising eyebrows around the world.
Carney has made that tension worse by openly arguing that the old world order is breaking down. He has said economic integration can be weaponized through tariffs, financial systems, and supply chains. He warns that smaller countries can no longer assume compliance will guarantee safety. Those arguments may sound sophisticated at Davos, but Washington hears something else. Canada is trying to organize resistance to American influence. Carney's middle power strategy has therefore become part of the problem. He wants Canada working with Europe and other countries to reduce dependence on the United States. Again, diversification by itself is not irrational. The problem is that Canada spent decades becoming deeply dependent on America and then started challenging that relationship before creating any serious alternative. That is where the panic begins.
They're also preparing a massive volunteer reserve force of over 400,000 people, ready to defend the nation in a crisis. NATO allies, including France and Britain, could be called in to provide support.
Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports go to the United States, according to the supplied references. That means Canada's biggest customer is not Europe, China, India, or some future trade bloc Carney can announce at a summit. It is the country directly south of the border. Canadian prosperity has been built around access to the American market for decades. And those exports are not just abstract numbers. They are physically connected to the United States. Pipelines run south. Railways run south. Highways run south. Auto parts cross the border repeatedly before a vehicle is finished. Energy systems, factories, refineries, and distribution networks were designed around North American integration. Ottawa cannot redirect that entire system to Europe or Asia because Carney gives a strong speech.
We're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must.
That is why American economic leverage looks so much like ownership. If Washington tightens access, Canadian industries feel the damage almost immediately. Ontario Autos, Quebec Aluminum, British Columbia lumber, prairie agriculture, Alberta oil, Saskatchewan potash, all depend heavily on the American market. Canada may be politically independent, but economically, huge parts of the country already operate inside an American-centered system.
Alberta isn't leaving because a bunch of right-wing radicals are standing up to vote for independence. Albertans are leaving because the federal government has given everyone in this country the finger for so long and padded their own pockets while telling us to shut up and keep paying.
The resource story makes this even bigger. Alberta sits on roughly 165 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, according to the supplied material. It produces millions of barrels every day, and much of that oil flows directly into the United States. American refineries were built around Canadian crude. Canadian producers were built around American customers. That relationship already functions like one integrated continental energy system.
A series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited.
Saskatchewan adds another strategic layer. The province is a major global potash supplier, and potash is essential to fertilizer and food production. Western Canada also contains uranium, natural gas, agricultural output, and critical minerals. These are exactly the kinds of resources Washington considers strategically important. So when people ask why the US keeps looking north, the answer is obvious. Canada is sitting on enormous value.
We've been ignored, disrespected, unrepresented, and enough is enough. Every province, when you look at this graph, should be saying, how much are we contributing versus getting back? Maybe it's time we leave too.
The irony is that Ottawa has spent years making its own resource sector harder to develop. Pipeline delays, regulatory uncertainty, environmental restrictions, and political fights have frustrated Alberta and Saskatchewan repeatedly. The provinces producing the wealth feel like Ottawa treats them as a problem. Meanwhile, the United States looks at the same resources and sees security, energy, food, minerals, and industrial power.
And also in an apparent warning against efforts to appease major powers, Mark Carney said that countries like Canada can no longer hope that compliance will buy safety.
That internal Western frustration gives Washington even more leverage. Alberta and Saskatchewan already feel politically sidelined by central Canada. Western alienation is not new, but the pressure is becoming more serious because the resource economy is more important globally than it was a decade ago. If Western provinces ever demand significantly greater autonomy, Ottawa's ability to hold the country together becomes much weaker. The federal government understands that risk. Remove Alberta's energy wealth from the Canadian fiscal structure and everything changes. Federal revenues change, equalization politics change, export earnings change, national infrastructure priorities change. That is why every serious Western autonomy debate makes Ottawa nervous. Canada is not just a collection of provinces. It is a financial structure that depends heavily on the resource-producing West.
Canada has 68,000 active troops, 82 tanks, and 77 fighter jets, compared to America's 1.3 million troops, 5,500 tanks, and 2,200 aircraft. Conventional battles are impossible.
Meanwhile, the American side holds the stronger hand. The US market is many times larger. Canada sends the majority of its exports south, while Canada represents a much smaller share of total American exports. That makes economic pressure asymmetrical. When Washington introduces tariffs or threatens restrictions, the damage spreads faster through Canadian industries than through the broader US economy. That means Ottawa could lose freedom in two directions at once. Carney wants independence from Washington, but attempts to build relationships with Beijing could trigger even stronger American pressure. The US could demand limits on Chinese ownership, Chinese technology, Chinese infrastructure, or Chinese access to Canadian resources. Suddenly, Canada discovers that sovereignty on paper does not automatically equal freedom of action.
His response is to scapegoat, to double down on blaming some other party and then to try to change the plot. He's even said that. He's attacking Canada, using Canada as a scapegoat, and also to try to change the narrative from the bad things that are happening in the American economy, gas prices, the failures of the war with Iran, and so forth.
The military side is equally uncomfortable. Canada is reportedly considering involvement around Greenland alongside European partners, while Washington has made Greenland itself part of a larger strategic conversation. Carney publicly supports Greenland and Denmark determining their own future. That puts Canada politically beside European governments at exactly the moment the United States is asserting stronger control over its northern strategic environment. Now imagine the position Carney is in. He is challenging American economic influence, supporting European partners in the Arctic, talking about middle powers resisting great powers, exploring diversification toward China, and insisting Canada will defend its sovereignty. At the same time, Canada depends on the US for its largest market, continental defense, intelligence cooperation, energy infrastructure, and access to integrated supply chains.
$1 billion. What's the outflow to the federal government? $84 billion, and that's PIT, CIT, GST.
That is why Ottawa's response looks increasingly nervous. Carney can describe this as a new era of sovereignty, but Canada enters that era from a position of dependence. The government has not built enough alternative infrastructure. It has not rebuilt the military. It has not diversified exports enough. It has not resolved Western alienation. It has not secured the Arctic independently. Washington knows all of that. The American strategy does not need tanks, annexation papers, or a giant check with Canada written on it. Control can be built through access, tariffs, trade rules, investment restrictions, defense arrangements, Arctic navigation, and resource integration. That is how modern power works. You pressure the systems a country depends on until its choices become narrower and narrower.
Peter Navarro saying those Canadians, they're the worst. And I sort of understand it as a tool of rhetoric, of just sort of, attacking somebody else. But is there any kind of long-term gain that might emerge from it? Because I can only see the negative side, what cost it's going to have in terms of repairing the relationship down the road.
And that's entirely correct. And if you think about it, their attacks on Canada now are an attack on the trade deal negotiated in Trump's first term.
And Canada's choices are already narrow. Ottawa cannot cut off American trade without wrecking Canadian industries. It cannot block U.S. Arctic access easily without creating a defense crisis. It cannot remove American military cooperation without exposing enormous capability gaps. It cannot suddenly sell most exports somewhere else. It cannot replace American investment overnight. Carney is talking about independence while operating inside a structure built around dependency. That is the real panic behind this story. The United States has not literally announced a cash offer to purchase Canada. What it has announced is a strategic doctrine that treats the hemisphere as an American sphere of influence, combined with political rhetoric openly questioning Canadian independence and economic leverage powerful enough to make those words matter. And that is the problem Carney can't solve with another speech. Canada spent decades building an economy tied overwhelmingly to the United States while failing to strengthen the alternatives. Now, Washington is openly asserting hemispheric dominance, and Ottawa is discovering that sovereignty is much easier to declare than to defend. The US may never officially buy Canada, but it already holds enough leverage to make Carney understand why the idea no longer sounds impossible.